Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of For Freight's Sakes. Today we are going to run through Incoterms. Um, to me, I have found that many of the people that I speak to don't fully understand what Incoterms are, which is why I have put together this basics of Incoterms for your benefit. And it'll give us an overview of what it is. Please note, Incoterms training can take 2 weeks if you want to get into it in depth. If you want to understand the full legalities of everything. Incoterms are legal terms, and they do describe a lot. So it is important that you know them, but it's also to me more important that you understand how or why they can benefit your business. So should you change your Incoterms? If so, why? But let's first run through what the basics of Incoterms are. So Incoterms stands for International Commercial Terms. And there is a definition on the screen for you. If you'd like, I can send you this PowerPoint presentation. Just pop me an email. My email address will be in the description, so you can reach out to me. But basically, it's an agreement between a buyer and seller, and it's regarding the transportation and delivery of goods. And it especially clarifies who is responsible for costs, risk, duties, etc. during the importation of the shipment. Um, and it can be vital. It can literally be the difference between your business making money or not. So it is something that's important, and it is something that you need to be aware of. So let's clarify a few points on Incoterms. Incoterms provide a common language. So especially when you're doing international trade and there are language differences and language barriers, Incoterms is a common three-letter codes that is generally accepted and generally understood. It specifies where responsibilities change hands, especially where risk of damage or loss is transferred from the seller to the buyer. This is vitally important. They're globally accepted. They're accepted by governments and legal authorities. They can determine how your taxes and duties are charged, are based on Incoterms. Generally, Incoterms are updated every 4 years. The last update, however, that I'm aware of was 2020, and those are the generally accepted Incoterms in practice now. When stating Incoterms, to protect yourself, you can also state the year. So you may want to state Incoterms 1996, for example, or Incoterms 2020, because as mentioned, they are updated. They're also not valid for all modes of transport for all the Incoterms. There are some Incoterms which specifically state things regarding a vessel. So they are only valid for sea or inland waterways, like your FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF. The remainder of the Incoterms are valid for air, road, sea, and can be best utilized as you need them. So let's jump straight in. The first Incoterm that is commonly used is Ex Works, and this is the lowest responsibility of the seller. So basically, almost everything falls onto the buyer's responsibility. The seller will have goods ready at their factory door, and when we say ready, the goods need to be ready for the mode of transport and for the sale. So Ex Works includes packaging the cargo for the mode of transport that is to be used. So you cannot pack cargo, for example, in secondhand boxes with string around them if you know that this is going to be in ocean freight. It's just simply not going to get there in the manner in which it is designed. So it is a seller's responsibility to ensure that they're packed correctly. It's also the seller's responsibility to ensure that their necessary documentation is available. So you can't, if you are a seller of goods and you want to sell them Ex Works, and you know that you're doing an international sale, you will need to be registered as an exporter. And so in South Africa, many customers do want to sell on an Ex Works basis because they aren't responsible then for air freight. You are limiting yourselves as to the buyers that you can attract. So I've mostly seen Ex Works used on imports out of Europe. Uh, European suppliers tend not to want to get involved in freight at all, and they use Ex Works. Moving on to free carrier. So this just takes things a little bit further. The supplier now is not only responsible for the seller, sorry, not only responsible for packing and getting the goods ready for export, they're also responsible for taking them to a certain place. FCA, free carrier, is very common in air freight. So The seller is not responsible for any of the terminal charges at origin. It's not responsible for freight or anything at destination. Cost, risk, and insurance are all up to a nominated place. And named place of delivery is an important term here because it is vital that you name it. So if you were importing and you'd place an order with a company in America, they could very well say to you, okay, my Incoterms are FCA China, but which airport in China? It can make a significant difference as to which airport it's going to be. So they'll need to state that it's FCA Shanghai or FCA Shenzhen, for example. And similarly with Europe, if they are going to be selling on an FCA basis, and let's say you're doing FCA to a port as opposed to an airport, remember that the terminal charges at origin are not covered by the seller. So it'll be basically transported to the port or very often to a consolidation warehouse, whereafter the buyer then takes over the cost, risk, and responsibility and insurance. Generally, this is used for things like break bulk, roll on, roll off cargo, out of gauge sea freight, or air freight. It's uncommon in general full container ocean freight or LCL ocean freight. So something to be aware of, not something that pops up all that often that I've seen for South Africans. Carriage page 2. So this is a little bit of a different one. And again, this is something that as an importer and exporter, you need to be aware because the cost of the freight and the responsibilities with regard to risk and insurance change hands at a different place. So the supplier, the seller is responsible for the cost of freight from themselves all the way to the destination terminal. Let's say, for example, I am importing something from China, from Shanghai, and I need to get this to myself in Cape Town. I tell the guys in Shanghai, please cover the air freight for me. And they say, no problem. We'll do a CPT, carriage paid to Cape Town, South Africa. Wonderful. And they quote me on air freight. It's included in the cost of my product. Fantastic. Let's go ahead. However, they have not included any insurance, and therefore their risk and insurance will only cover until the terminal of departure. As soon as it gets to the terminal of departure, all risk and responsibility is mine. I can insure myself if I'd like to as the buyer. However, if I don't note that and something happens to that cargo while it is in transit, it can become a nasty argument. So please be very, very, very aware of where risk and responsibilities change hands on carriage paid to Incoterms. To mitigate that risk, carriage and insurance paid to is often a more commonly utilized Incoterm. So similarly, supplier will pay for the freight to your destination terminal. They'll also pay for insurance to your destination terminal. The risk, however, still remains yours. So as the buyer, the risk is yours. Seller's risk is only to their door. If something happens, they will then say to you, okay, here's the insurance agreement, go ahead and claim. Or, okay, here's the tracking on the flight or the vessel, go ahead from there. There is not a huge amount of responsibility on the shipper under Incoterms CIP. In order to transfer that, you can work with Incoterms DPU. So here the seller is now taking it all the way to a terminal or to a warehouse at destination. So the buyer's risk and responsibility is generally only local. They will collect and take it to their warehouse. And it's a place unloaded. The seller is also responsible for unloading the cargo. So this is more commonly used if there's a consolidated container and whether you're importing or exporting. Once the consolidation container has reached its destination terminal and it's been unloaded, then the goods become the responsibility of the buyer. So the buyer needs to customs clear and arrange delivery. If, however, the buyer wants even less to do with the cargo, you can buy on a DAP basis. Now, DAP means that your cargo is delivered to a place, generally the buyer's factory or the buyer's door. Um, so very similar to what we see in courier with the door-to-door service. So here, the seller is responsible for every aspect up to the buyer's door. This is something that's commonly asked for or used on exports, especially to countries into Africa, or where people are unsure in dealing with South Africa as a third world country. So I very commonly see DAP in exports. I don't generally recommend it because if the buyer doesn't have the necessary paperwork and documentation in order to import, if they don't pay the taxes and duties timeously, this cargo could sit at the consolidation warehouse, and any storage or penalties incurred are the responsibility of the seller. So it is of vital importance that either you trust your buyer implicitly, or alternatively, let them take over the responsibility. Now, even more so, the request is for DDP. So DDP means that not only are you delivering to the buyer's door, you're also covering the costs of duty. So you're delivering it, paying any duties that are on it. This is maximum risk and responsibility from the seller. And duties can be so fickle and in various countries because they change all the time. It depends on where governments are and what they're wanting on various products. So it's generally not advisable for the seller to pay the duties. Generally, it's advisable for the buyer to pay the duties, but it varies according to what your agreements are. So if you're launching a new business and you've got a wholesaler in another country and they're going to be buying a lot of product, but they're just concerned that the product's not going to sell and you're very confident in, then go ahead, pay the duties on it, because then the seller knows, or the buyer at the end knows exactly what the landed cost of goods would be. But it's not really that sustainable. So depending on your particular needs, that's what it is. Not really encouraged. Yeah, in a general shipping term, a lot of responsibility on the seller for it. So moving across, these Incoterms were all of the multimodal Incoterms. Let's move on to what is only particularly available for sea freight. So free alongside ship. This again is one where the seller is responsible for costs, risk, etc., up to and including the terminal, but they are not responsible for anything to do with the vessel. Again, this is one that is commonly used on items that are out of gauge or bulk items. So very often where the ship has its own equipment to load itself. I've seen that quite particularly with free alongside ship. Where it's containerized, FOB becomes a lot more popular, and we'll jump into FOB right now. But yes, you can see highlighted at the bottom of the slide, the FAS, free alongside ship, places a responsibility on the buyer to load the goods onto the vessel. So often the buyer's dictated which vessel is going to be there, and the vessel needs to have the necessary equipment in order to load this cargo onto itself. Generally with containerized cargo, what is more common is this, which is FOB. So free on board means that your supplier has, the buyer is going to be responsible for booking the cargo with the shipping line. They get the choice and option of which shipping line they want to use. They will cover the freight charges. It's the seller's responsibility to pack the container once it is released by the buyer, and to get that container into the port, into port stacks. And thereafter it becomes the buyer's responsibility. So the buyer will cover the freight, insurance, and everything to destination. This is very, very popular, especially out of the East on imports. And it can be very popular for exports on low value items. But generally, I find South African exporters want control of their freight, as do South African importers. And it's great. There are reasons that you want to control the freight. You can determine routings, you can determine which shipping lines. Generally, you can get pretty good pricing if you're negotiating well with your freight forwarders. But the difference sometimes between one shipping line and another could be $100. But let's take an import out of China to South Africa again as an example. And let's say you're an importer based in Cape Town, where I am. You may find that there's a shipping line that's $100 cheaper for a container. Great. Who doesn't want to save $100, right? But this particular vessel may transship, or you may be shipping from another port. It then transships in Shanghai or Shenzhen, and it's going to take 2 weeks maybe to transship successfully there. Then goes to Durban, where it transships again, another week or so while it transships in Durban, and then it makes its way slowly down to Cape Town, which means that you've got a sailing time of 6-7 weeks ultimately from once it's left origin. There may be another line, $100 more, who sell directly and saving you 3-4 weeks. So these are the sort of considerations that you will take into account and that are to your benefit. It's not really to the seller's benefit if they are paying the freight to give you these sort of options. They don't want to be paying $100 more. So they will generally go with the cheapest possible line. Um, and it doesn't matter if there isn't necessarily space or that type of thing. They just want to give you the cheapest possible option. So as soon as you've got a booking, you've got a booking. So yeah, that's why FOB is very, very popular on imports. It gives the buyer that control over the shipping line or airline. Well, FOB is only for air freight, but when you can use it as FCA for air freight. Okay, moving on to cost and freight. Similar to what we've discussed earlier, cost and freight is a sea freight term, ocean freight or inland waterway, and this is where the seller includes the freight charges. So, the cost of freight on the vessel. But again, there is a risk and insurance transfer at while on the ocean, or basically once it's loaded onto the vessel. So there is a gap between your cover once the cargo is onto the vessel and once it gets to you, which needs to be included or discussed. So check with your insurer check with your seller that they are insuring, and ask them to insure all the way to your warehouse if they are going to be covering the freight on your cargo. This cost in CFR is not encouraged if you're doing less than container loads. Please be very, very, very aware of handover fees, excessive unpack charges, etc., which can come your way. I will do a separate video on those, but I think it is vitally important that you understand this is considered freight prepaid because the freight is paid at origin, and it's highly discouraged on especially less than container load cargo, but even full container loads. So just be very, very cautious when using CFR as an Incoterm. Last on our list is CIF. So similar to CFR, the seller is going to be responsible for your freight until destination terminal. The insurance, again, that's the difference. So this time it includes insurance, and insurance will be to destination terminal. Risk, however, changes hands in the ocean. And the reason I say this is because when you get to destination terminal, you're not going to have any cover. So your container is going to come off the vessel, and it's basically uninsured unless you've insured it yourself. And the shipping line or the insurance companies don't like initiating an insurance policy at destination terminal. They will want to inspect the cargo once it comes off the vessel in order to implement insurance at that point. So if you've got something hugely bulky or very expensive, absolutely, and the seller wants to include their insurance and their freight, and you're worried about it being on the ocean, that's absolutely fine. But remember that inspection is going to come at a cost, and quite an excessive cost. And your insurance rate, ironically, is often lower when insuring from an FOB port versus insuring at a CIF point, even though it's over a longer transit. That's a whole different video and a whole different conversation point. But just be very, very aware of where the risk changes hands on the CIF and CFR. So yeah, that's a very brief, and I promise to keep it brief and to the point, but that's a brief rundown on what Incoterms are. And let's just touch up on some key points to know. So again, we've mentioned the purpose of Incoterms. We've mentioned that there are different types of Incoterms, and they're often categorized by the letters that start. So the E Incoterm is Ex Works, the F is for freight, and that includes any of your freight charges. The C Incoterms include generally cost and freight. Cost and freight means the cost of purchasing the product and the freight is included in that price, and then D is delivered. So just when I say cost and freight and I mention price, let's take an example of me buying a pen from a supplier in China. So let's say I have bought my pen for R1 at X Works. If I'm buying it on an FOB basis, they've now covered a portion of the freight. So the FOB cost of the pen would then maybe be R1.10. If I'm buying it on a CIF basis, so my supplier has now covered the freight and everything, the freight and the cost and insurance on a CIF basis, then what I'm paying them for my pen then becomes maybe R1.30 or R1.40 per pen. And if they are delivering it to me, perhaps it becomes R1.50 per pen. And if they are delivering it, including paid duties, and there are duties applicable, perhaps then my pen becomes around R1.75. So that's what I mean by cost and freight or Incoterms charging. So the cost of your cargo is the Incoterm is built into the cost of your cargo, and this is important. For example, on South African SARS, you pay on the FOB value of your cargo. That's how they calculate the taxes and duties. So if you're importing on a CIF basis, you need to notify your clearing agent as to the freight cost and the insurance cost, which then need to be deducted off the value of the cargo to get back to an FOB rate, so that you're paying your tax and duties on the FOB value of the cargo and not on the CIF value. Often easier to simply just import on an FOB basis, which is very common. Another point is that it's very unusual to import out of the Far East on an Ex Works basis, and it's something that you need to be careful of, because if you are importing on an Ex Works basis, your freight forwarder often has to send a dedicated vehicle to go and collect the cargo. So especially if it's less than a full container load, they can be traveling quite a long route in order to collect the cargo and bring it through to the port or airport where the freight will take over, or where your freight forwarder can take over. And if they're using dedicated vehicles, that can be quite expensive. Whereas if you are importing on an FOB basis and the supplier is delivering it, they may have other deliveries that they're bringing into town or bringing into another area. So for them, it's not as expensive as sending a dedicated vehicle to collect. I hope that makes sense. So yeah, that's just touching on the different types. Responsibilities, remember the Incoterm defines who pays transport, insurance, customs clearance, as well as who is responsible for risk or loss or damage. So be aware where that risk transfer takes place. Be aware that you shouldn't be using Incoterms that are not valid for that specific mode of transport. So FOB air freight is technically not valid. FOB, technically, risk and responsibility and cost transfer once the cargo passes the ship's rails. So once it goes over the ship's rails. Now that's not going to happen in air freight because there aren't the ship's rails. So if ever it came down to a problem, if cargo was damaged while being put on the aircraft and your Incoterm was FOB, it could become a bit of a legal argument. So rather just ensure that you're using an Incoterm that's valid for that particular mode of transport. Incoterms are implied by default, but should specifically be included in your contract of sale. And you need to include the place in the Incoterm, as well as preferably the Inco dates. So as said, currently we're working on Incoterms 2020. That was the last version that was reviewed. They do often get reviewed every 4 years, but it just depends on what's happening in the market. So especially if you've got a larger deal, please make sure that you're stating, I would like you to quote me on manufacturing this product on FOB Incoterms 2020 basis. Please provide your nearest port. And then they'll come back and say, okay, Shenzhen's my nearest port, great. Please proceed. Provide me with a quote on FOB Shenzhen Incoterms 2020. Then you clarify. It also gives your freight forwarder a very clear understanding of where they need to help you quoting on freight and insurance, etc. It provides clear communication between everybody and particularly reduces the likelihood of disputes, which we've mentioned. It is, however, not a complete contract. It only defines the Incoterms aspects of it. So Incoterms doesn't tell you what your payment terms with your supplier are. Your payment terms with your supplier might be 50% deposit and remainder once shipped on board. But shipped on board doesn't determine your Incoterm, and similarly, your Incoterm doesn't state that your payment terms are 50-50. So it is important. And finally, I've mentioned it, but I think it's worth reiterating. And I see there's a typo, so hopefully it'll stand out. Incoterms are incomplete without a place. So it is vitally important that you do include a place when you are putting your Incoterm together. So it is invalid or pointless without a place. Absolute last point that I noticed on an email that was sent to me earlier today with a client that's learning Incoterms. They were importing and they asked me to quote importing on a DDP basis. And I understand that they want me to include everything, including your duties and taxes and delivery. But you need to remember that the Incoterm is based on where you, as either the buyer or seller, are at. So DDP is not a valid Incoterm for an importer. Well, it is a valid Incoterm for an importer, but not to give to your freight forwarder, because you don't need a freight forwarder. If you are importing on a DDP basis, then your supplier is going to cover everything. So yeah, just remember to look at the Incoterm in your role as either buyer or seller, so that you fully understand where your risk and responsibility takes place, as well as to inform your freight forwarder as to where they need to help you. So I hope that covers everything. Remember, these videos are designed to be interactive, so please ask questions, please comment. I will delve deeper into certain things, but I don't know what to delve into if you're not telling me. So I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope this helps. Thank you. Bye.